So welcome everyone. It's a special pleasure to have you back on this episode and start of a new season of Zoom In. At least that's our plan. With my partner in crime here, Antoine Duval at the Acer Institute, we hope that we'll be able to continue designing a program that will be of interest to you with a variety of topics and guests around themes that make the news in international sports. And so for us, an obvious though perhaps not the lightest or easiest topic to start into this new season was the reaction of international sport to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And in view of what is happening in Ukraine and the region, you could say pondering about the sporting consequences of a war may be a little derisory. However, we know or we'll see that sport has enormous, not only financial, but also symbolic power, and therefore reactions of major sports organizations are not insignificant in this geopolitical landscape. And in addition, one of our most recent events in 2021 was about Rule 50 of the Olympic Charter. You can find this issue online. Rule 50, which limits political expression for athletes at the Olympics, and with the debates around sports organizations' eagerness to curtail the freedom of expression of athletes in order to have a neutral terrain at the Olympics. And now we have sports organizations themselves who are stepping up on the political scene, taking measures against Russian athletes and Russia. And interestingly, we had very recently an interview by the Corriere della Sera in September. We had IOC President Thomas Bach, who implied that Russian athletes, I quote, took distance from the regime and do not support the war, could be allowed back on the neutral banner. And this, of course, Bach himself conceded, ma non è facile. So how do you implement this in a context in which even implying that there is a war may be punishable in Russia? And finally, it's also a topic of interest to us because the sports resolution system has also been asked to take a stance. There are proceedings around decisions made in football by UEFA and FIFA that are pending before the CAS with provisional orders that were made already in April 2022. So to discuss the intricacies of the positioning of the sports bodies in this conflict, today we are very pleased to welcome our three guests. So first we will hear from Dr. Daniela Herd. I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Daniela. Daniela is a researcher also at the T.M.C. Acer Institute in The Hague. Her work focuses on human rights in sport. She also works as a consultant for the Center for Sports and Human Rights, and she defended her PhD thesis on human rights abuses at mega sporting events in 2021. Daniela has looked at different categories of reactions that Russian invasion into Ukraine entailed from different sports governing bodies. She'll tell us about that. Then Professor Carmen Perez, who is a professor of public international law at Universitat Carlos III de Madrid in Madrid. She's written extensively on sport in connection with EU law, also with the protection of athletes, and relevant to our topic. She's also written an online text putting the reactions around the war in Ukraine into the context of other past political events and the Lex Sportiva. And finally, well, last but not least, my colleague here at the Institute of Sports Sciences in Lausanne, Carol Gomez, who is working in particular on gender-related abuse in sports and other issues. Carol is really a multifaceted researcher. She has a legal background, but also extensive backgrounds in, say, relations internationales, and now work in sociology. So she's also a research fellow at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. So Carol will give us a somewhat, maybe more, let's say, geopolitical view on the issues. First, I'll give the word in a second to Antoine, who will introduce the topic a little bit more in depth. But before we start, just a couple housekeeping points. As always, The seminar, the webinar is live streamed on the ASA YouTube channel. It will be recorded and then made available on that YouTube channel after the webinar. And after our guests' introductions, you will be allowed to ask questions either through the chat and we'll read them out, or by raising your hands and intervening directly. And please, in that case, wait until Antoine and I call you up. And until you do so, please do not forget to mute your mic. So now I give over to Antoine.
Yeah. Thank you, Marjolaine, for the introduction. One minor correction: it is not live streamed. It is being recorded and will be put online on our YouTube channel. So we're not on a live stream this time.
Sorry for that.
No, it's just because we changed the format to a Zoom meeting so as to make it more interactive, but in return, it is more difficult to live stream the discussion. Well, thanks already for the introduction. Already a few things have been mentioned, and I'll try to keep my own introduction quite brief. But I just wanted to refresh a little bit. Why are we sitting here? Well, mainly because quite quickly after the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have witnessed, I think, at least from my perspective, unprecedented and extremely swift reaction from the international sports governing bodies, and in particular from the Olympic movement, with a number of decisions excluding Russian teams from prominent international competitions, but as well individual athletes. This is still a very, very much ongoing and disputed matter. And you have to understand, I mean, just to prepare, I went on the website of Inside the Games, and maybe some of you are familiar with this digital newspaper that is focused on sports governance, in particular in the Olympic movement. And I just, searched Russia. And over the last week or so, there were at least 15 articles about different international federations dealing with the Russian question in a way. So this is really something that it's burning, it's moving all the time. There are a number of procedures that are going on before the Court of Arbitration for Sports. It is maybe the main question of our time for international sports governance, and as well for international sports law, because sports courts, in particular the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and maybe at a later stage, the Swiss Federal Tribunal and the European Court of Human Rights might have to say something, or will have to decide on these issues. And I just wanted to highlight 4 issues that I think are important in the discussion, and that I want to put on the table, and I hope, I know will be related to what our speakers will say. The first one is the more like philosophical question of the political neutrality of sports governance and the Olympic movement in particular. As many of you will know, there is this fundamental mantra, or even some would say dogma, of the Olympic movement, that of the political neutrality, which is enforced through sanctioning mechanisms against athletes who express political opinions, and as well against national members of the Olympic family, be that federations or national Olympic committees, in which there is some political interference. And those enforcement mechanisms are active all the time. So there is this neutrality is not just formal, it's also doing things, it's also excluding people from participating in sports. And the question is how to reconcile that dogma, that doctrine, with the Olympic movement's reaction to Russia's invasion. And in a way, this is a question that is being posed over and over again, also before the Court of Arbitration for Sports. Isn't there a contradiction? That is one of the main questions. Can we keep that idea of neutrality when a country, through the sporting representatives of a country, are being excluded on the basis of a fundamental political act of that country going to war? That's one question, and it's the fundamental one in a way. But then there are the more like nitty-gritty legal questions that are raised by the discussions about the debates about the compatibility of the exclusion of Russian athletes or Russian teams with the statutes of the sports governing bodies concerned. And these are more related directly to the CAS cases that we see emerging. And there we have already a few cases that give us a lot of indications on the legal route that is being pursued. The two orders by the CAS in the UEFA and FIFA case show us that until now, the justification, the legal justification for those exclusion is not going down the road of high-minded human rights policy or human rights oriented decision-making. It's actually all about force majeure and how dangerous it would be for athletes, Russian athletes and Belarusian athletes to participate in competition. So the irony is that the legal justification for the exclusion is mostly based on preserving the security of Russian and Belarusian athletes, and in general, the competitions. And just the integrity of those competitions in the face of massive threats of boycotts. So basically it's saying, because this war is triggering a lot of threat of boycotts, we are in a force majeure situation and we need to exclude you from participating in the competitions. That's the legal justification that is being advanced by sports governing bodies, at least UEFA and FIFA, to justify their decision to exclude Russian teams. So that's the second dimension that I think is important to discuss. The third one is a question of the legality, the legitimacy, and the legality of collective punishment. So we are dealing obviously with situations in which, in particular, athletes who have no bearing or immediate bearing on the decision to go to war of the Russian state are facing the demise of their sporting career and their professional career, for which they have invested a lot of time and a lot of energy. And that is really epitomizes the issue of collective punishment, which we saw already arising in the context of the Russian doping scandal, with there again athletes who were not directly involved in putting in place a system were still sanctioned and excluded from sporting events. And that connects as well with the mention, with Marjoleine's reference to the latest interview by Thomas Bach, who is trying to propose a way out for athletes to participate in competitions by, let's say, condemning the war. And this raises again a new host of questions, whether you can require athletes to condemn their own state and to risk the health and safety of their family members potentially. So that is another issue. And the final issue that I think we need to reflect on is, and I connect it more with the work of Carmen, but is the question of the interaction between international sports law and governance and international law. What is the role of international sports law and governance in potentially enforcing international law, enforcing international norms, enforcing international humanitarian law or international human rights law? Should there be a role? Should an intervention be based on what threshold should an intervention be based? A resolution of the UN Assembly General or a decision of the International Court of Justice? We need to work and try to reflect, I think, on indeed how those two worlds of law are to interact, and in a way how one is to support the other, in particular through sporting sanctions. Are sporting sanctions a new type of compliance mechanism for international law? So those are four sets of questions that I think are interesting, relevant, that we should be engaging with today and after, and that I hope to will trigger some reactions also from our speakers, but also from our audience. And now I turn back to Marjolaine. I think it's Daniela's turn to speak.
Yes, thank you, Antoine. Daniela, the floor is all yours. I hope we have Daniela. I can't see.
I'm here.
Okay,
Can you hear me and see me? Okay,
perfect.
great.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Marjolaine, for the introduction. And thank you both for organizing this and inviting me to speak. My intervention will be, I think, a bit shorter than the others. But what I'll try to do is just provide an overview of what has happened as an immediate reaction of sports organizations, international federations within the Olympic movement to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, based on research that was conducted by the Center for Sports and Human Rights and the blog that I wrote together with a colleague there, Guido Battaglia, who is also zooming in today. And thanks, Marjolaine. I saw that you shared the link to the blog in the chat. So arguably, it all started with a statement issued by the IOC, actually on the day of the invasion, on 24 February. I think Antonio said that quickly after, well, it was actually on the day that the IOC issued a statement condemning the invasion. And this was followed quickly by some other sports bodies like World Athletics, UEFA, World Rugby, World Triathlon, and other federations issued similar statements with a bit of a different language. They then expressed concern for the situation, as it was done by the International Skiing Federation or the International Table Tennis Federation. The next day, then, the IOC recommended to all international federations to cancel or relocate upcoming events, following which the International Volleyball Federation's Men's World Championship was indeed removed. And other sports bodies and federations committed to not let Russia or Belarus bid or be candidates for upcoming events. So this was another type of reaction. Then a few days later, the IOC actually recommended that Russian and Belarus athletes should not participate in events anymore. And where this cannot be prevented, only participate without being associated to their countries. And from what we know, at least 39 federations followed that recommendation. Within football, actually, a number of national teams, we saw that they refused to play Russia. And then FIFA and UEFA also suspended Russian clubs and national teams from all competitions, but interestingly, not those from Belarus. Some international federations went further than that and excluded Russian and Belarus federations, expressed intention to suspend their memberships. This was done by the International Tennis Federation, World Athletics, and also, I think, World Rugby. So they announced that they would deliberate on this potential measure to suspend membership. And additional measures that were taken by other sports bodies were, for instance, the suspension of Russian or Belarus leadership representation within a federation. The International Automobile Federation did that, or also the International Canoe Federation. Then UEFA was the only one, I think, that actually took action that related to sponsorship. So they canceled agreements with the state-owned Russian sponsor Gazprom, while they had actually just renewed it the year before that. And there was another recommendation issued by the IOC a bit later that said that sports bodies should withdraw orders of honor. This has been done by the IOC itself. They withdrew orders of honor from Putin, also to other Russian officials. And the International Swimming Federation and World Taekwondo also followed this recommendation. The International Judo Federation and United World Wrestling had actually done that already before the IOC recommended it. And finally, another type of action or measure that was taken, it was again following, I think, the last IOC statement, which was actually a letter by President Bach, in which he called upon the Olympic movement to engage in humanitarian support for Ukraine. And at least from what we know, 15 federations again followed that call, including International Biathlon and the Ice Hockey Federation. So this was a bit of an overview. I also briefly want to reflect on these actions in comparison to actually similar situations. And I think it is very difficult, obviously, to compare situations of war and conflict. And I think that Carmen will go into a bit more detail on this. But I think doing this just helps to see that indeed the reactions by sports bodies are pretty unprecedented. So I share this opinion that Antoine already expressed. So for instance, if you compare it with apartheid regime in South Africa, there it took the IOC actually 16 years to exclude South Africa from the Olympic Games, and then a couple of more years to adopt the declaration against apartheid in sports. During the Balkan War, there was only a few international sports bodies that took measures. And this also only following a UN Security Council resolution, which I think Marco also pointed out in the chat already. So I agree, this is maybe not an entirely new situation, but it is unprecedented. I think as here, the reactions came without there being such a resolution, and the reactions were much more immediate, widespread, and based on recommendations, following recommendations of the IOC. And then also, if we look at places of conflict and war in the present, for instance, considering the situation in Yemen, no action has been taken there by any sport body in reaction to what is happening. And I think that, yeah, all this really shows, like it has already been said also by Antoine, that this apolitical nature of sports is somehow a myth, but basically also an argument that is used by sports when it works in the advantage of sports. 2 more points quickly. What has happened since then? So I think Antoine pointed it out that it's really still a very hot topic. A lot of sports bodies, federations are struggling with this. There are pending cases at the CAS. But I think that concrete actions or actually changes to those first immediate reactions, we haven't seen that many. Just last week, actually, the International Boxing Association lifted the ban on Russian and Belarus athletes as, I think, one of the first sports bodies, but maybe I'm wrong, but at least I think so. One of the first sports bodies to indeed lift that ban. And what this means is that from now on, athletes from these 2 countries can compete again, representing their countries. And as a consequence of all this, also the European Boxing Confederation said that it will follow the IIBA's lead and allow Russian and Belarus participation at its events, which, however, doesn't apply yet to, I think, their upcoming women's championship, because apparently I think the list was already closed, according to the European Boxing Confederation. And as a final point, some very brief reflections on the human rights dimension of these actions, as this is my background, and Antoine actually already mentioned parts of it. But I think, as we know, one thing to mention is that, as we know, some of the sports bodies that have now taken measures and decisions have also recently committed to human rights through human rights policies, through changes in their statutes, or different kinds of actions. But interestingly, indeed, this has not been raised as an argument or as, sorry, I think, there you go, thank you. Yeah, it's okay now. So interestingly, this has not been raised as an argument or a justification for taking these decisions or measures. But instead, it was indeed about the safety concerns from the perspective of the athletes that were hit hardest by these measures. So that's a bit the irony here. And then sticking to the perspective of these athletes, I think that's another human rights dimension here. So obviously banning and suspending them has a huge impact on their lives. In this case, the Russian and Belarus athletes we're talking about. Some of these things that become relevant here are really, I think, things like talking about their livelihoods. If they're professional athletes, they of course also have a right to work. They depend on the income, but more generally applicable, of course, is if you think about it, the issue of discrimination and actually the right to non-discrimination. So I think it's very interesting to stress that again, that this human rights dimension hasn't really been part of the discussions. I do hope that perhaps through these pending procedures that we maybe see a bit more of that coming up. But yeah, we don't know yet, of course. I'll stop here, and I'm very curious to hear from the other speakers and be part of the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Actually, you've already made yourself the transition to comment, so I don't have much to add. As you mentioned, we already have some comments in the chat about the efficacy or lack thereof of sanctions in the example of Yugoslavia, and I think Carmen mentioned in her blog the UN Security Council resolution in that case. So she can address that either in the presentation or then in the discussion. So yeah, I'll give over directly to Carmen. Carmen, I think you have some slides.
Yes, I will try to. Can you see them? Yes? Okay. So yes, first of all, I would like to thank Antoine and Marjolaine and the Acer Institute for having me today. It's a really pleasure for me to share this conversation with Daniela and Carol and the rest of participants. And yes, I will mention the UN Security Council resolution because my intention is to adopt a public international law perspective to the, in this field. So I will try to focus on the obligations or powers of states when they deal with a situation like the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation and the consequences, the eventual consequences in the field of sports. So I will try to give you a very brief theoretical overview and then a practical one, and then I have some questions for the debate. So I think it is useful to start with a couple of examples. As you maybe know, in September 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution recommending to the EU and the member states to decline invitations to the Beijing Winter Olympics because of the human rights situation in China and Hong Kong. So this is one of the first example I wanted to share with you. And the other one is the statements that around 35 states have adopted on Russia's war on Ukraine and international sport. These statements have been adopted in March and July 2022. And as you can see in this slide, these around 35 states announced in the statements their intention to adopt a series of measures in the field of sport, not only against Russia and Belarus, but also against athletes, sport governing bodies, teams, and even possible sponsors. So having these examples in mind, my question would be, what does international law say about this? Why a public international law approach is useful? Well, I think we can agree on the idea of the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine being a very serious breach of public international law. In fact, we are talking about a violation of a peremptory norm of general international law. These kind of rules, jus cogens rules, protect the most fundamental interests of the international community. So in consequence, international law imposes specific obligations on states in the face of such international wrongful acts. These specific obligations are mentioned in the International Law Commission draft articles on state responsibility for the commission of internationally wrongful acts. And in particular, I would like to mention Article 41, because it specifies which are these specific obligations. According to this article, states shall cooperate to bring to an end through lawful means any serious breach of an obligation arising under a peremptory norm of general international law. So states have the obligation to cooperate by these lawful means to bring to an end the situation caused by Russia by the invasion of Ukraine. So the question, of course, is which lawful means or which means can we consider lawful in the sporting domain. States can take self-redress measures, and also sanctions can be, on a more institutionalized way, sanctions should be or can be adopted by states or international organizations. So when we talk about self-redress measures, we are talking about retortion and countermeasures, and then we have measures. As you maybe remember from your public international law classes, retortion measures are unfriendly, but they are legal. So they are responses that are legal, but maybe they can be considered unfriendly. The typical example is the breaking off of diplomatic relations or the recalling of ambassadors. And in my opinion, these sporting boycotts can be considered retortion measures. I mean, they can be seen as acceptable methods of retortion. They are unfriendly. The fact that you don't send your representatives to our opening ceremony to any city in the world can be seen as unfriendly by China, for example, in the example I gave before, but they are typical and I think can be also effective vehicles for political protest. So we are not talking about sanctions when we talk about, in my opinion, when we talk about sporting boycotts, and they are not illegal. Countermeasures are historically known as reprisals, and when they involve the use of force, we can consider that they are today prohibited by contemporary international law, but they are legal if they don't involve the use of force, the so known as non-forcible countermeasures. So they are illegal, but they became justified by being a response to a previous violation by the other state, in this case, for instance, Russia and Belarus. This possibility is subject to limits, and we find these limits again in the international law Commission draft articles on state responsibility, and a typical example is the suspension of the application of an international treaty, which in principle is not justified under the treaty itself or the law of treaties in general, but this breach of the treaty becomes justified because of the previous infringement by the other state. And finally, we have sanctions. I think we don't have a single definition of international sanctions, so we can use a purpose-oriented definition. So we can say they are any measure taken against a state to compel it to obey international law or to punish the state for the breach of international law. Contemporary practice tend to apply a smart target sanction, focus or applied not to states in general, but to a specific persons, legal or individual persons. I will tell some more things about these smart sanctions later on. We can also try to define sanctions from author-oriented approach. So in this case, the question is who is adopting the measure, and I think that we can agree on the idea that we talk about sanctions, international sanctions, we think of international organizations adopting this kind of measures because they are entitled to adopt this kind of enforcing measures. So we are talking about institutional sanctions because, in my opinion, again, unilateral sanctions are mostly seen as not permitted by contemporary international law. And of course, we can refer to sanction according to the type of measures undertaken. We talk about economic sanctions, political sanctions, cultural sanctions, and again, sporting sanctions. And yes, we have some practice. international practice. I mean, in the UN or at the UN level, I think we can mention the UN Convention Against Apartheid in Sports, which is an international treaty that was adopted in December 1985. And as someone has mentioned in the chat, there is a precedent in this UN Security Council resolution adopted against Yugoslavia under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So the convention, on the one hand, was adopted in 1985, but it entered into force in 1998. It has 63 states that are parties to it, which is not a lot, taking into account that other human rights UN treaties are almost universal. Yeah, I wonder why. I think this is a good question, why this international treaty got a relatively, small number of parties. It was conceived as an international legal tool for combating apartheid specifically, but maybe we can think of this convention as a model for other cases of gross human rights violations, like maybe war crimes, or crimes against humanity, or the crime of aggression, which is one at stake in this case. You have here in this slide some examples of the kind of measures or obligations that the states assume by being part of this international treaty. So these are obligations focused on not permitting the practice of sport in countries and from countries where apartheid is, in countries that are practicing apartheid. And on a different vein, we have the example of this UN Security Council resolution. As you know, not the UN General Assembly, I'm afraid, but only the UN Security Council can adopt binding resolutions authorizing or imposing sanctions when a state or a member state is breaching international peace and international security. And this measure may involve or not military force. So we have plenty of examples of economic and diplomatic sanctions that have been decided by the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And as far as I know, we have this example of Resolution 757 adopted in 1992 against Yugoslavia, and it had consequences. For instance, Yugoslavia was banned from the European Football Championship that year. The team had qualified for this championship, and it was replaced by Denmark, who finally won the tournament. So the obligation imposed by the resolution is the one in pink. All states should take the necessary steps to prevent their participation in sporting events on their territory of persons or groups representing the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So a question is this effective? I think someone asked this in the chat. We can discuss that, but in this case, it's legal because it's an obligation imposed by the UN Charter. So I would like to finish with 3 final remarks that maybe can be, questions for the debate. I referred before to target or smart sanctions that are meant to focus not on states, but on leaders, political elites, or segments of society believed responsible for the unlawful behavior. So the question here, when we are talking about sanctioning athletes, teams, or sport governing bodies, is are sporting organizations, sport governing bodies, or sport people among these, targeted subjects? Second, maybe it's more a philosophical question, but we should I think it's there. Many people think sport should keep neutral. So should the sport be left out of international sanctions? Because I think experience shows that neutrality not only has informed the international federations or the International Olympic Committee when they have invoked neutrality to disregard the political situation or a situation of human rights violation in a given country hosting a major sporting event. I think neutrality has also been assumed by states, and they have supported these events, even in countries where human rights situations were, below the international standards, to say the least, and they have supported this neutrality with the presence of their representatives. So this should stop here after the invasion of Ukraine, or not, or maybe neutrality is a value we have to protect. And finally, a final reference to the position of the EU. Sporting sanctions are not among the sanctions that have been adopted by the EU against Russia and Belarus since the invasion of Ukraine, but I think we can think of the possibility, maybe these sporting sanctions will be used in the future. You have to take into account that the 27 have signed or supported the declarations of statements to which I referred at the beginning of my presentation. So maybe sporting sanctions will be a venue, or I don't remember, a mechanism of compliance according to Antoine's definition. In that case, I think the role of the European Court of Justice could be decisive to limit and to set the lawfulness of the political response of the European Union. I'm sorry if I took too much time. Thank you very much. I will be happy to participate in the discussion.
No, it's perfect, Carmen. Thank you very much for this contribution. We apologize for the interruption. I don't know whether it was related to the topic or just random, but it seems to be sorted. So we'll finish with Carol. I'll give you the floor and then we'll be ready to start the discussion.
Many thanks. Can you hear me correctly? Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you, Marjolaine and Antoine and Acer, more globally, to invite me to this event. It will be quite difficult to say interesting things after two brilliant presentations made by Daniela and Carmen, but I will try to give some idea. My presentation will be in two parts. The first one will be focused on try to understand why this answer, why the world of sport react like this, and the second part will be about the perspective and what can we expect in the future. To be really honest, I will not bring a lot of answer, but I will raise many questions. I hope you will give some food for thought for the debate. And trying to not repeat what Daniela said, in my opinion, it's really important to come back to the beginning of this situation, and the fact that everything was not really clear at the beginning, and the world of sport need to react and need to do something against especially Russia, but also Belarus. It's also quite important to notice that for Russia, sports diplomacy was a key element of its foreign policies. It was developed during 20 years. It was a very important part of the Vladimir Putin policies. So it was not at all a domain took by it was a very good choice to deal on this one. And I also have in mind that the sanction was quite important against Russia and took everyone a little bit left a little bit surprised, because it's just an hypothesis, but it was also because, in my opinion, Russia was already on the ridge line since 10 years, especially after the doping cases, and especially when we saw how IOC, but also how other international federation try to react to this scandal. So the two things was could explain, but it was also about the context. When the invasion of Ukraine happened, it was at the very end of the Olympics in Beijing, and the Paralympics did not begin yet. So, and it's perfectly mentioned in the IOC press release. They react very quickly, and they point out the question of the breaking of the Olympic truth. And it's quite interesting to it was the case in Daniela article, but it was quite interesting to really focus on what IOC mentioned, the situation, and what were the word that they use. They definitely think that it was a breach of the Olympic truth. It was a dilemma for them. It was they use sentences like with a heavy heart. So it was the situation really put IOC in a very complicated situation, and it was also quite interesting to see how they tried to find a solution, find a way to gather everyone around them, but at the same time try to react really quickly facing this situation. And it's Marjolaine mentioned it at the beginning of the conference. The interview
for president 2024
of Thomas Bach in the Corriere della Sera mentioned also this this first statement, but at the same time he really tried to focus about what will be the situation and what will be the next step, and he really wanted to try to give some answer, but at the same time he was very cautious about this, saying that regarding the situation has not evolved, so we have to consider that there is still a dilemma, that is still a decision to be made, and the sanctions are still here. Two other things to mention, but it was already mentioned by Carmen and Daniela about the reaction of the United Nations. It's also interesting to see that in this case, the world of sports was more proactive and more react in a very quick way rather than international organization. It's perfectly understandable, like Carmen said, regarding especially the council, the Security Council of the United Nations, with the presence of Russia as a permanent member state. But it was also interesting to see how the world of sport reacted collectively and very quickly, and it was at this point a quite interesting point to mention. Even though I fully agree with the remarks before, it was not the first time that something like this happened before, and indeed, and as mentioned, as Carmen mentioned also, it was also interesting to see how the European Union react on this way. Carmen, you mentioned the two documents that they published in March and in July, and it was also quite interesting to see how they try to gather together the 27 member states, but also other countries around, in order to give to this declaration a more heavy weight, in order to be present in the negotiation and to be more efficient. Marco highlight very important things in this in the chat. It was about a key element when you think about sanction. It's the question of effectiveness. Why, when you try to find a solution, when you try to sanction, how do you know it will be effective, and how do you find the good way to have the more important impact? And in this case, it's not really. The answer is not really clear. At the beginning, all the world of sport was following the same path, but as Daniela mentioned, we have something like some change, especially with the IBA decision last week to lift ban against Russia and Belarus, and more precisely, they also decided to suspend Ukrainian Boxing Federation 10 days ago, at the end of September, because of politicization of this federation. So it's also quite interesting to see that at the first time there was a very complete and unit reaction, and then the situation become a little bit less clear, and the unity is not so present today. So about the second part of the thing that I would like to mention about the perspective, it's also quite interesting, in my opinion, to have in mind that the situation seems the way that the world of sport react, the way how they react, the way how they implemented the sanction seems to me like a really first time. And it's also interesting to think about what will be the next step. It will be an exception, or is it the creation of a new way to react, considering a violation of international law? And it was Daniela who mentioned all the many other conflicts that didn't where the world of sport did not react. But it's also interesting to have this in mind. For example, if another important countries, or if another country decided to invade another one, the question will be, does the IOC will take exactly the same decision, or it will be another decision? And another remark that we could do about sanction still, it's also when you think about sanction, it's the concept of effectiveness is really important, and many study in political science say that actually effectiveness is really low when you don't prepare carefully what will be the goal that you want to achieve. So we have to perfectly understand what will be the target, what will be the aim of the sanction, and why do you sanction this athlete or this federation or this organization. And in this case, it was not really the case. It was a more global sanction, except for some interdiction against president of federation, as Daniela mentioned. But there is something that it was not present in all the document that I show, and all the statement that I have a look on. It was a question of the lifting, how to lift sanction, and so how to come back to a classic and to a normal situation. And it's also highlight the question of effectiveness in order to force the several countries to get them around the table again, and which is exactly the point of the way to sanction, to try to develop this point. So I think that I forgot a lot of things, but I will definitely will have time to say more during the conversation. And it was more about a global a global overview and some reflection. But I give the floor to Marjolaine and to Antoine.
Thank you very much, Carol. Maybe one of the guests will want to react to another one, and you are now also able to intervene in the chat or by raising your hand. We've seen three different, maybe I'll add a few thoughts because I have the mic, so I'll feel free to do it. We saw really three different angles that are interesting, and when Carol was finishing, I was really reminded of all these debates we had these past years about the collective sanctions in Russian doping. But there we had an unlawful, so to say, conduct within sport. And here we are, so to say, taking collective sanctions to the next level. But we still have the same questions, and we saw it in the chat. It was about, well, effective, is it effective? Who do we target? And then Carol, you said, then what do we do once we've imposed sanctions? How do we lift them? And so maybe a bit a provocative question, but did they have the choice? Was it really about the sanction, or was it just a form of reputational exercise? Because you said they were very united, they acted very quickly, collectively. Now this unity is crumbling because everyone has sort of made the politically correct statement, and now the sports governing bodies actually have to decide, okay, so what do we do now? So that's a bit the question I'm giving into the floor.
Yeah, maybe may I say something? Yeah. You know, word on smart and target sanctions, because I saw some questions in the chat about the possibility of sanctioning officials of sport governing bodies who have direct connections to the Russian government, or even international referees. So for me, smart sanctions are a practice that are, you know, a more recent practice that seeks to avoid the indiscriminate suffering that traditional sanctions provoke or cause to the population as a whole. So the idea is to target to focus on specific groups to avoid this general suffering. So you focus on the groups you are intended to focus because you want sanction to have an impact on them. But of course, you have to have a purpose. So purpose is to force compliance with international law, or maybe punish the country because of the violation of international law. And you have to choose the concrete people. So I could have to think more about the possibility of people at the IOC having connections with, I mean, you have to have in mind the purpose. It will be effective. Is there any possibility of Russia coming back to legality by sanctioning these people? Maybe in the case of officials at the IOC could be, I don't know. But in the case of referees, I think it doesn't make sense. It's like, to punish anyone in the country. So I think we have to keep in mind that you have to have a purpose. You have to look for some effectiveness when you apply or adopt a sanction. And legality is a different thing. Can be legal, but ineffective, and as in the case of Yugoslavia, maybe. And in the case of the European Union, I think it is important to have the European Court of Justice there, because we have interesting case law in the past, CADI and other examples of the European Court of Justice saying the European Union, even if you are applying a Security Council resolution, which is mandatory or binding, there are limits you have to meet. So yeah, it's important, the presence of the European Court of Justice in this case.
Maybe Marjolaine, shall we open the floor for questions.
Sure. Just to be clear, the five, our three guests, you don't need necessarily to raise your hands. Just feel free to open your mic, as long as you are not interrupting others. That was more for the more than 40 participants that we have in now. So Carol, if you'd just like to add something, then I see we have a question from Frank Lati.
Yeah, actually, it was two things. I put something on the chat about the concept of smart sanction, but two more remarks, food for thought. I study in the past international sanction, and it's quite interesting to see how difficult is the reflection about effectiveness, because it could be really yes or no, and there is no place, no room for the middle, and you have to in all the document that I read about, and all the reflection that I read about was about two things. The first thing was to try to be very more precise about what will be the objective of the sanction. The most precise the sanction will be, and the more efficient they could be, because they will be very practical, very precise. And the second thing will be about the concept of maybe not effectiveness but more performance, in order to have more answer possible to give it will be not Manichaean answer. So it will be quite interesting also to change our set of mind in order to give other things. But I was too long, sorry.
Yeah, maybe before I turn to Frank Lati, if you ask a question, please also introduce yourself very briefly before doing so. Then first a question from Frank and Lati, and then a question from Marco Begovic, and we'll take both questions and then answers from the floor.
Okay, hello, I'm Frank Lati, so I'm a professor of public international law at Université Paris-Nanterre. And I want to thank the three speakers for their very interesting speeches, and congratulations to Antoine and Marjolaine for the organization of this webinar. As a professor of public international law, I have a question for Carmen, because I was very interested in her public international perspective. If I correctly understood what she said, Carmen, you talked mostly about sports sanctions taken by states, which may have a legal basis in public international law, based on Article 41 of the draft articles of the International Commission on conventions such as the Conventions Against Apartheid or Security Council resolution. My question is whether you think, Carmen, that the sports sanctions taken by sports organizations may be based also on public international law. Can they be considered, I don't know, as countermeasures in response of a gross violation of youth against norm? And I also note that no one spoke about the violation of the Olympic truce by Russia, which is it's quite interesting, because it's a public international law norm, because it is recognized by the General Assembly of the UN, but it's soft law. But it seems to be also a sports norm, which was invoked by the IOC and other sports organizations. So is the Olympic truce also a public international law norm that may found in some way the sanctions taken by sports organization? Thank you.
Maybe let's take the question also from Marco, and then a round of answers.
Yes, Antoine, thank you for your availability to speak. Thank you very much for all three interventions. I really appreciate it. Just one, maybe more common than question, but it can be taken as a question. The concept of neutrality, we should always, as a researcher, challenge it from a different perspective. We need to differ from here between effectiveness and the legal ground of the sanctions. Not to go further, in the last 30 years, the members of the UN Security Council have been engaged in different military campaigns without UN Security Council approval. Interventions in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, Georgia didn't produce action from the sport movement per se. So having in mind, especially from 1992 and effects of the sanctions, we really needs, I mean, the question for all three speakers, if they can elaborate more, what are the effects of these sanctions? Are they going to change the aggression of Russia? Are they going to change what is happening? No, I believe that they're going to just damage the sport, especially the individual athletes per se. Thank you very much.
So I think Marco's question is interesting on both aspects. Again, discussing the effectiveness. So do these sanctions have an effect actually on the war, or is this just kind of a communication exercise? So that's one aspect. And in the other aspect is the double standard question. So when do we expect sanctions? If we have sanctions in this context, why didn't we have sanctions, let's say, if Saudi Arabia is attacking Yemen and it's considered also to be a basic violation of international law? So here, that's also a real question, I think, that is raised by the entire set of issues that we're discussing, the double standard and how to create a standard or a threshold from which you could have a certain objectivity in triggering those sanctions. And that I leave to Daniela. You already want to say a few words. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just I think agreeing. So we're reacting to Marco first, and then I'll let Carmen react to what Frank raised. But agreeing with Marco's observation very much that it appears very selective, and I think I also said it in my talk that the reaction this time around is perhaps just somehow benefiting sports, and I'm not sure in what way, but I think perhaps if we try to find the justification or the legal grounds for their actions, to be honest, I think there are not really any, because the one that they could have raised, which was the human rights argument, especially for those that had recent changes to their statutes or policies or regulations, they didn't show that this was a consideration in their deliberations on these decisions at all. So I do believe that probably the reactions we saw this time around was more a reaction to other stakeholders in the sports ecosystem that expected sports to react this way, or the IOC to lead and make certain statements, then really, based on certain rules and regulations. Of course, we do have this Olympic truce concept, which I'm actually very critical of, to be honest. So yeah, I do think we don't see any red threads throughout these actions. This is a precedent because of the way it has happened, and also the wide-ranging effect it has, and indeed, unfortunately, on individuals and damaging the sport. I don't think it will help to stop what is going on. I mean, it did nothing. That's the war is just continuing. So one thing that I just want to finish with is this point that was made at the end of I think it was Carol's talk about, will this set a precedent for future situations like this? So I find that very interesting to think about. In one way, it actually probably does, because I mean, all of us here, we're monitoring and tracing what is happening, and it does raise certain expectations perhaps for the future. But if we look back, then, sports has reacted in different ways to different situations, and basically just the way it suits them. I would say. I'll stop here.
Maybe Carmen
Yeah.
on Frank's questions, and then we'll hear Carol can then maybe react to both or as she wishes.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. First, I would like to say something about this idea of the double standard, which is quite obvious in the reaction of the sporting movement after the invasion of Ukraine. And my idea is just because something has not been done in the past, it doesn't mean it's not legal now. Okay, it is. Maybe it was illegal in the past. I mean. Sport neutrality has gained a lot of criticism in the past. And now we have examples from states and from sport governing bodies of, more important involvement in politics, in the face of a very exceptional situation, because, invading a country is something that doesn't happen every day. So it's quite serious from, an international, public international law perspective. And I mean, apart from that, thank you very much for your question, Frank, because, your book about transnational sports law is one of the first works I read when I became interested in international sports law. So thank you very much for the question today. Okay, first, in my mind, international sanctions are institutionalized or at least collective responses. So I understand there are unilateral sanctions, but I have more problems with this kind of reactions because in the past they are connected to abuses from certain states. So I'm thinking of institutionalized when it is possible. The Security Council, the European Union, according to, a concrete legal basis, Chapter 7 and EU law, or at least collective responses, like the statements I mentioned in my presentation. And they can be adopted by sport governing bodies. We need sport governing bodies also to enforce state or international organizations sporting sanctions. We have to, to enforce or to apply through the sporting movement, because we need the action of these sport governing bodies to make the sanction real in the end. But I don't know if I name that countermeasures. No, I don't know. I have to think. It's a difficult question for me. I will think of that. But again, in my mind, countermeasures are between states. Okay. So when it comes to the sanctions adopted by sport governing bodies, they need a legal basis these measures have to rely on lex sportiva, their own statutes, and maybe public international law, and the obligations imposed by international law when, such a situation arises, maybe can have a role to play in the decision. But I think, the legal basis are the sporting, piece of legislation permitting, according to Antoine, it is, force majeure, in this case, or the protection of athletes, which is, I agree with him, a very weak argument. But I don't know if we are talking about countermeasures in this case. But thank you very much for the question.
Yes, thank you. I'll let Carol react. I just wanted to add on this. It is interesting what you said, Daniela, about the fact that no organization, sports organizations raised human rights arguments, which could have been an imaginable basis. I'm not sure they are very keen on invoking a human rights basis when they have other issues in which they are basically denying the applicability of human rights. So it may create a precedent if you rely on human rights on one side and not on the other. And as Carmen just mentioned again, in the CAS proceedings, UEFA and FIFA seem to rely mainly on a real almost commercial contractual argument, which is force majeure. Well, you know, we couldn't foresee this. This is basically some ground for us to alter the contract, and that comes back to the objective in the end. What, in order to and so I'll leave then Carol to comment, is if we don't know what the objective is, we can't really measure effectiveness. And if so in the end, can we measure the objective any more precisely than it has happened now?
Yeah, thank you, Marjolaine. You give me a big question. Yeah, in order to answer to the question of Marco, indeed, effectiveness is key. But in my opinion, we have to we talk about the objective of the sanction, and in my opinion, we have it was developed in literature, in political science, say that one sanction does not have only one objective. It every single time have a primary objective, a secondary objective, and third objective directed to the target, but also directed to the community, the world, but also directing addressed to the national population. For example, when I will just make a comment about the last call for boycott against Beijing 2022, when Joe Biden decided, for example, to launch a diplomatic boycott against Beijing. It was, of course, for human rights issue, of course, to in order to highlight the situation, but it was also for, in my opinion, for internal, national reason, in order to show to the Americans that he's doing something. He's not, it was active on this one. So you're completely right, Marjolaine. The effectiveness or the performance of the sanction has to be measure regarding each very precisely each objective, but it's also depending of the emitter of the sanction. For example, if it is only one state who take a decision, it will be, of course, very counterproductive. But on the other side, the decision is taken more globally in the UN for 50 states. What it was, how it was when it was the case, for example, for the boycott of Moscow Olympics, it will be, of course, more efficient. Nevertheless, and in order to synthesize the answer, in my opinion, sports sanction does not have a direct effect because the situation is not changing so easily, and it's almost impossible to pretend to do so. But it participates to a global to a global answer with other economic sanction, diplomatic sanction, political sanction, and in order to force the countries to come back to the table of negotiation, or to coerce them to change their policy, or to force them to act in a way that they want to do. So yeah, it's not, in my opinion, it's not a direct effect. It was more something like a communication tool, but it participates to a global work, a global answer. So it could be interesting, but it's not a key element.
So that's interesting. So we don't only have collective sanction, we actually have a sort of concept of collective effectiveness that we should measure. So it's a participatory act to a more collective action. I don't know whether anyone still wants to react on the two previous questions. Antoine, would you like to? I don't think we have any more questions in the chat right now.
Well, I think there was one more question, I think, in the chat. Why do you think the sports governing bodies reacted so quickly and in unity when there has not been any precedent like this before? I think Donna Donatadia. I think, and here I come back to the point about force majeure. In a way, what is interesting with those cases before the CAS is that they are not about sanctions. They are not about peace. They are not about human rights. They are clearly, and so it is argued, about just a force majeure to a contract, some kind of random event that happened. And in a way, FIFA and UEFA are saying we're not even judging that event. We don't consider it bad or wrong or right. We just consider it disruptive for our competitions. And the disruption is linked to your participation in those competitions. And that's why we decide to exclude you from those competitions. So what is interesting, I think, is there is also, it is telling to some extent that it might be also for commercial reasons that those sports governing bodies decided to react so strongly rather than for ethical or political commitment. It is because, in a way, their primary market is European and remains European in a sense of Western European, and that they were seeing the risks that their competitions would be massively boycotted. Imagine a Russian football team in Qatar, in addition to the number of other issues linked to migration, to migrant workers in Qatar, would have potentially indeed jeopardized the good organization or even the existence of those competitions. So here is a potential provisory answer when we look at the massive response, and that's definitely the big difference with Yugoslavia in the mid-90s. Yugoslavia in the mid-90s, I mean, the IOC had to be forced by the Security Council to actually act. Here we have the opposite situation. The Security Council of the UN cannot act, obviously, for clear reasons in terms of the veto of Russia. But it is the sports governing bodies that issue the sanctions almost on, I mean, Daniela is right, on the day of the invasion. So we have a totally different situation in terms of the way the reaction was structured. And I think it is in part due to, indeed, the feeling inside the sports governing bodies and the Olympic movement in general, that this was a very, very unpopular war. And that this unpopularity would potentially threaten commercially and in terms of safety, those events. And that's how this is being justified before the CAS. And in a way, that's how the story of neutrality is being preserved. And if you look at this interview, the recent interview by Thomas Bach in the Corriere della Sera, he mentions that, you know, they felt pressured to do so by states, and that they would have, in a way, preferred to find a way to preserve the participation of the athletes, but it was too threatening for the existence of the competitions. And so that's, again, here you have another way to formulate the language of force majeure. So that's a very interesting dimension of the discussion, which is the gap between maybe the commentary about the idea that sports is going to be useful to serve to enforce international law or international human rights, and on the other hand, the practical legal nitty-gritty dispute, which is about a concept that is stemming from commercial law, force majeure, and that is framing the entire justification for these decisions. So that's an aspect that I find personally fascinating in the discussion that we're having.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I agree with you because, but this is not a rationale behind the states. I think when states think of sport as a way of making, you know, to enforce international law, they are thinking about the economic impact of the sanction and maybe the cultural impact of the sanction. And yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. This so again, it's not. You can say that even taking this measure, they kept neutral because they don't judge the, if the invasion is right or wrong. We keep neutral about the legality or of the measure. We are worried because about our competitions and the impact the participation of these teams and athletes can have.
Mm-hmm.
So neutrality is there, even if they took the measures.
Yes,
that also means, oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that also means that effectiveness is rated completely differently within sport. And that defines the objective, actually. Then the objective becomes, okay, can we continue to carry out our sports competitions and derive income and image therefrom? And there the effectiveness is not measured at all with respect to whether it has any effect on Russia, but whether the product sport is still successfully sold, so to be said.
And maybe one point on the commercial aspect, what is interesting is in one recent article, there was a criticism from the Ukrainian Football Federation because FIFA is still deriving revenues from selling the broadcasting rights for the Qatar World Cup to Russian broadcasters, and they have not cut those contracts, obviously. So the contracts that bring in money are still in place for FIFA in terms of the TV revenues. But what is interesting as well is that behind this idea of this is only about force majeure, there is still a non-neutral assessment of when is a war too disruptive for the organization of a sporting event. So it seems that what they are arguing to avoid the double standard is to say the Ukraine war is special because it was so unpopular in, let's say, the West, that it created so much disruption that we cannot keep you on our competitions. While the other wars were not as disruptive. Basically, the Iraq war, the Yugoslavia war didn't trigger enough backlash for us to react and for us to invoke our force majeure clause. So that's going to be probably the type of argumentation that will be brought forward before the CAS to justify the double standard, to say, well, in this case, it's force majeure because just this war is so much more unpopular than all the other wars before. And that's why we need to cut you loose.